Welcome everyone who has signed on already. We will get started in about a minute. Phyllis is going to ask in the chat where you're all calling in from today and what your role is within your district. So again, we'll get started very shortly here. All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Emily Paisner. I work at Daybreak Health, a school-based mental health provider who provides services like teletherapy to school districts all over the country. My other job that never seems to stop is being the mom of 2 tweens, which is why I am personally very excited for this conversation today, because I just can't seem to figure out what's going on inside of their heads the majority of the time. I am thrilled to welcome Phyllis Fagell. She is a licensed clinical professional counselor who has been a school-based mental health counselor for more than 15 years, working with students in grades K through 12. If you haven't had a chance yet to read her first best-selling book, Middle School Matters, I would highly recommend it. And her next book, Middle School Superpowers, is coming out in August. And in fact, the first 50 people who registered for this webinar are receiving a copy in the mail. As soon as it comes out, we've already pre-ordered it for you. So please keep an eye out for it. Phyllis speaks at school districts across the country on a broad range of topics around youth mental health and education. She's a regular contributor to the Washington Post and is frequently featured in publications like Psychology Today, CNN, the New York Times, The Atlantic, NPR, and more. Before we get started, I wanted to let you all know that we will be sharing a recording of the webinar out with you all. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add them to the Q&A section. I will try my best to incorporate them throughout the conversation, but we will also be leaving time at the end for all of these questions to be answered by Phyllis. Phyllis, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who came. I know at this time of year, it's really difficult to make time for PD and conversations like this, so I appreciate it.
It has been a tough few years, not only for kids, but also for educators. The pandemic, staff shortages, violence in schools, racial injustice, really the list could go on. And not only have our students been in crisis, but educators have gone through and are going through a lot as well. So before we get into talking about kids and their mental health, what can our educators do to help with their own mental health, especially as a lot of these folks have some time off, hopefully for the summer? What can they do to really nurture their own mental health?
I saw a great meme the other day that said teachers in the summer are not on vacation, they're in recovery. And my advice for educators is really the same as my advice for kids. It's a time to unplug as much as you can, get outside, try to practice self-care, which looks different for everybody. Something that's really interesting to me is that the most effective self-care for adults, especially educators, anyone who's in a helping profession, is not things like yoga or getting more sleep, which of course matters too, but it's making time to have substantive conversations with someone who cares about you once a week. And that can be somebody that you just agree to have as your go-to person, or it could be a more structured groups through an organization like acgroups.org, but really trying to use that summertime to do all of the things that you didn't have a chance to do during the school year.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. So we've all experienced teen angst before, whether we felt it ourselves when we were this age, or we felt the wrath of others going through this time in their lives. And this has been an especially hard time for tweens and teens. They had years of a lack of in-person social connections. They're spending a lot more time on social media. And, we've all heard about the rise in depression and anxiety and sadly, even suicide. And you've coined this term extreme tweens to describe this point in a child's life. And so can you share with us why kids are so extreme at this point and how the dynamics that I shared above have really contributed to this?
Sure. So when you factor in everything that's going on in the world, plus everything that they've experienced on a day-to-day basis, plus the ongoing news that they're getting exposed to. I have so many kids, even in whether they're in my school setting or in private practice, who are suddenly having fire drill anxiety because they associate it with school shootings or school violence. Everybody has used up all of their resources. And as much as I would love to say that we are back to normal, I actually think we're at the point where kids are just starting to process and to deal with all of the trauma and all of the stressors that they've experienced over the last few years. And so they're the same developmental phase as always, only more so. We know that tweens and teens always are socially sensitive, always are pulling away from parents and spending more time with their peers. But now they're trying to make up for lost time, and they're doing it at a time when they've had less practice. So their social skills are weaker. They're not as adept at reading feedback. So they're more likely to take offense. Their ability to resolve conflict in a constructive, productive way is diminished as well. So we're seeing more behavioral problems in the school setting. It's really coming out in every way: disorganization and just overall resilience and ability to bounce back from any kind of setback has been compromised.
I'm sure that a lot of the educators that are joining us today have experienced all of this throughout, the past year or two, and it's not easy. So you are helping educators to really harness what superpowers these kids do have. The book that you have coming out is called Middle School Superpowers, and you share 12 superpowers that teens and tweens really need to be successful. And I'm going to share them on a slide in a moment, but I know there's 12, so that's a lot to go through in a short period of time, but I would love if you could talk more in depth about the ones you think are most important to kids who are struggling emotionally right now.
Sure. Yes. And the reason I came up with these new superpowers, because I had 10 skills that were really important to middle schoolers in Middle School Matters, my last book. But what we've seen is that these post-pandemic extreme tweens need a whole new set of skills. And in terms of your audience and this topic, the two that really have the most relevance are probably super healing and super vulnerability. I think of super healing as preventative. It's how do we teach kids to self-regulate? How do we help them build their coping toolbox so that when they do face these stressors, when they do have this social sensitivity, or they do get that score they didn't like on a quiz, or they come to school after getting in a fight with their parent in the car and they're just feeling off, or they have to take a risk and speak in front of the class, how do we make sure that they know how to first identify what they're feeling and then do something about it to feel empowered and not like they're at the mercy of their emotions? Super vulnerability is more reactive. It has to do with helping kids who already are dealing with some sort of real challenge. It might be an eating disorder. They might be cutting. They might be getting in a lot of fights. They might have been the target of a really bad cyberbullying attack and they're having trouble coming to school. It could be anything along those lines. How do we teach these kids how to ask for help, who to ask for help, and when to ask for help? And one of the things that I've often said educators can do that's so powerful and so simple is to simply identify as a helper. And that doesn't mean you're a counselor. And I mean, everybody in a school building right now is a counselor, whether they want to be or not. But regardless of your skill set, it allows you to create that introduction, that entree for somebody to come to you and say, here's how I'm struggling, or here is how my friend is struggling. And you can be that bridge to help them get the support that they need. So you can walk them to the counselor and help them tell their story. Or if you're the counselor, you can find that outside resource that might be most appropriate for them. And something that I see all the time in the school setting is that, number one, tweens and teens, but tweens especially, have a hard time knowing when they need support, when it rises beyond the normal mood fluctuations of puberty. If they get to the point where they realize they need support, they don't know who to ask for support, and they're very likely to ask a similarly impaired 8th grader instead of an adult. And if they wait until they're in crisis to determine who they would go to for help, they have a really hard time sorting out what to do and who to go to. So helping them think through who they would go to if they were in a crisis, which adult that would be, really reinforcing that it's an adult, maybe defining anxiety and depression for kids, very simply, so that they understand that there is a difference between the regular ups and downs they might be experiencing and that deep sadness or that disruption that is interfering with their ability to get through the skills of daily living.
As you said, everyone is a counselor, and whether you are an actual school counselor, a history teacher, a principal, no matter what your role is in a school, you're seeing the struggles that kids are facing every day, and it really is affecting their ability to learn. And more than half of the kids who need mental health support can't access it right now because our school counselors are overburdened, and there's a shortage across the country of qualified mental health professionals. So how have you seen schools and all of the people within the school really create this ecosystem to help fill these gaps?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. We can't really bridge that gap. That's part of the problem. We don't have enough resources to meet the needs of all of the kids. And so we're trying to get really creative. And that means folding in some of these skill building exercises and activities into regular courses and finding ways to organically incorporate it, even if it's a math class. So I mentioned earlier that their relational needs, their social needs are so intense right now. And we have a math teacher in my school who will say to the kids, this is what I need to get through. If we can get through X, Y, and Z, I will give you 7 minutes at the end to socialize. I know it's important to you. So first acknowledging that it's important to them, showing them that respect, building that time in. I know some teachers who are having conversation starters, and maybe they have 5 kids practice a specific conversation starter at the beginning of each class, just so that they can practice those social skills that are so rusty, and giving that feedback. I really loved how you made eye contact, or how you listened, or how you talked about that and saw that from someone else's perspective, but finding ways to just fold those lessons into coursework and into teaching itself. So it might mean that a kid is teaching the class about a topic, or they're working more in small groups, and that can be messy at times too, but it's more important right now because they have that skill deficit and they have those needs right now. And that all plays into the emotional well-being as well. The more they feel that sense of competency, that ability to go out to break instead of hiding in the math staff bathroom on the 2nd floor, the easier of a time they'll have assuming positive intent, the easier of a time they'll have attending to whatever's going on in that classroom.
And how have you seen schools help to fill this gap when there is such a high need for additional mental health support and, frankly, just not enough staff to be able to support all of the needs?
I think the counselors in all of these school communities are trying to get creative too. I know in my own community, there's a therapist who has created something called the Resilience Builder curriculum, which she's training teachers to use so that they are reinforcing these lessons, especially for kids who don't otherwise have access. The reality is that very few therapists take insurance. And the ones that do take insurance, there's usually a 6-month, if not longer, waiting list. And even if somebody is full pay and able to see the first available, they still may have a very long waiting list. So a lot of group practices are doing more group therapy to try to reach more kids at once. I know for myself personally, I feel like I'm offering my left arm to therapists if they will take one of my students, and just doing anything we can to help them. And it's more important in the school setting that we are really mindful of giving kids mentors, that we are designating trusted adults that teachers are really attending to some of those emotional needs that otherwise might not be getting met, not only because they don't have a therapist, but because so many of the adults in their lives, including teachers, are compromised as well. And I know for me personally, one of the tricks that I've been using, because I no longer trust my brain to remember everything, is that if a student tells me something, maybe they have a track meet that weekend, or they're in a debate tournament, or they're going to visit their grandparents in Virginia, I'm actually writing it down so that I can circle back to that child and ask them how it went. Those small gestures actually go really far in terms of helping kids feel that sense of belonging.
That's incredible. And I know that, again, you've created this sort of educator's toolbox to help kids cope with these challenges. And I'd love if you could share some of the tools in that toolbox for our listeners today, because I know a lot of them could probably leverage those when they think about, I know we don't want to think about the new school year quite yet, but as they are, going into the 2023-24 school year, what things can they start to do to really help kids cope?
I think everybody has to play to their strengths, and everyone's strengths are different. So some people are natural advisory teachers, and they are great at bonding one-on-one with students and forging those relationships. And those are the people that should be in those roles. Other people are not necessarily as adept at making those connections, but they might really be good at noticing what's going on around them, and maybe sharing that with someone else in the building who can get more involved on a personal level with those students. Just having their ears to the ground. There are some teachers that are really comfortable incorporating social emotional lessons into the curriculum, regardless of the content, and other people are less so. But if you're comfortable and there's something going on in the classroom, let's say kids are frustrated because their classmates are asking them to reveal their grades, and it's annoying, and nobody is really willing to explain that it's annoying. They just feel frustrated, but there's this undercurrent in the classroom that people are annoyed. That would be a situation where you could really empower the kids and say, I'm going to break you up into small groups. I want you to talk about this issue. I want you to come up with how you see the problem and what some potential solutions are, or maybe some pros and cons of asking classmates for grades. And then what I have them do when I do an activity like this is write each of their potential solutions on different sticky notes, and then stick them up all over the walls of the room so that everybody's are just mingled together with no names. And then I ask the students to get up, walk around, and find the one that they like the most. So it's a way for them to contribute to the discussion without taking on the risk of saying, this is my idea. They may very well be going and pulling their idea off the wall, but they have that plausible deniability if they need it. And we are looking to really show kids that all of them want the same thing. Similarly, if there's a situation, and kids are so much more risk averse right now, and I have one of those superpowers was super daring. A lot of kids are shying away from going to class or participating in class, or they don't want to run for student council, or they don't want to try out for the play. There are so many big and small risks that kids are having a really hard time with. Even standing up to a classmate who says something offensive is a huge risk for especially a middle schooler. And so I try to prove to them that the risk is smaller than they think. So for example, I'll say, I noticed in the cafeteria that somebody walked up to the table and asked if a seat was free, and somebody said, no, it's taken, but I could tell the rest of you all knew it was open, and they just didn't want that person to sit there. And yet no one said anything. Can you help me understand why no one would say anything in that situation? And they might chime in with, variations on not wanting to be that center of attention, not wanting the negative attention, not wanting to become a target, not knowing what to say. And the list goes on. And then I ask them, how would you feel about somebody who would say something in that moment? And they'll say, I would think they were a strong person, or a kind person, or a good person. And suddenly they have that awareness that the social risk is actually smaller than they think it is. And if you're targeting all of these small interactions, which seem small in the moment, but are actually really big when put together, that is a way to improve the overall culture, which improves behavior and improves emotional well-being as well.
Those are great, tangible examples. And so if there are, mental health professionals or school counselors joining us today, how can you sort of help them enable other school staff members to really again, use these tools in more tangible ways, because I think sometimes it's hard to know, like, okay, so what do I do with that? So how can they train other people in the school community, whether that's other staff or even parents, to really, help create, again, these allies in youth mental health care?
I think thinking more expansively about what that looks like, it doesn't have to be straight up mental health strategies. So, for example, it could be in my school, there were a couple of teachers who are expert knitters, and they opened up their classroom to the whole middle school, anyone who wanted to come before school to knit with them. And they were very calm, patient teachers. And our head of school also knits and would show up periodically. And it was really amazing because it was this very diverse group of all genders, all races, all ages, 5th grade to 8th grade, knitting together of all things. And I was really fascinated by this because I don't think they necessarily all love knitting, but I think what they liked was this meditative activity before school, an opportunity to connect with peers, with caring adults. That's an example of something that a teacher could do that's not specific to mental health care. Another thing that somebody could do in the building that really changes the tone is maybe facilitate a book club or create a staff parent book club, anything that brings different members of the community together, or have a student advocacy group that you are the staff advisor to, or an affinity group. If there is an affinity group that you would relate to personally, you might be the perfect person to help run that affinity group. And one of the best ways to help kids emotionally is to normalize what they're going through and put them in a group with their peers who are experiencing something similar. And to have that role modeling of the adult who's willing to be vulnerable themselves is incredibly powerful too.
I love that idea of, shared connections. I think it's so incredibly important to build community. As I'm sure most people know, the Surgeon General just released another advisory about the effects that social media use has on youth mental health. And it's really challenging, even as parents, never mind educators, to regulate social media use. And so when kids are in school, they're clearly very distracting and cause a lot of problems. How have you been able to get kids to put their phones down when they are in school and there to learn?
So first, just a disclaimer, I'm in a K-8, so it's a lot easier to set those boundaries and enforce those rules than it is in a high school. My youngest is in high school, and I'm quite certain he has access to his phone throughout the day because he's sometimes texting me. So I recognize it's a lot harder in the high school. But what I will say is that kids do want that face-to-face contact with one another. The reason they want to get on their phones is because they don't want to miss out on anything. And so if it's a rule that's enforced fairly and equitably, the kids actually appreciate not having the phones during the school day. But if we target the problem by focusing on things like that Surgeon General study, which, true as it might be, isn't necessarily going to make a dent in their use, we're going to get nowhere. We're far better off, I found, if we really teach kids how to have some metacognition about their use. I love the acronym WWW. It comes from Laurie Santos, who teaches the Yale happiness course, and it stands for what for, why now, and what else. And it's really teaching kids to pause long enough to ask themselves, what am I using this for? Is it to get information for an assignment? Or is it to send, my 30th text to my crush who's not responding? Why now? Am I procrastinating? Am I bored? Am I lonely? And what else? Like, what else could I be doing instead? If I'm on there because I'm lonely, then maybe I could be calling a friend or finding someone to talk to. So we want to be developing their awareness, and even developing their awareness about how they feel when they get offline. And that's going to vary from app to app. So we know that the Instagram data is really bad when it comes to especially teen girls, and they're the first to say, yes, it's harmful to me, and they don't want to be manipulated. They don't want to be used by the social media companies. So giving them back that sense of control, that they can think about what works for them and when, maybe it makes you it distracts you from your worry or makes it easier for you to deal with a stressor if you watch a funny animal video, but it makes you feel a lot worse if you're looking at somebody else's social media feed and feeling bad about yourself.
So before we get to questions, and I'd encourage everyone who is on the line to start putting their questions into the chat. I was hoping, Phyllis, that you could share some pro tips with us, and again, how we can start thinking now about integrating this into our classrooms at the start of the new year.
Sure. So, I mentioned having that time to do just a sentence prompt, a question at the beginning of a class. This is something that can be done across the board, folding in that time, really being mindful of the fact that social risks are hard for kids right now and giving a lot of more structured alternative things that they can do. Some of the kids I see in private practice are having a really hard time with unstructured social time, and they really literally are. Maybe they're playing chess online in the library by themselves, or they are in that staff bathroom hiding away. So maybe having things like spike ball, or having something outside that gives them something to do. I had a kid who was afraid of recess, and we came up with a simple idea, which was he always wore hoodies. And the idea was just to stuff his hoodie pocket with a mini football, because all he had to do is like hold up the mini football, and there was someone who was more extroverted who would come over and want to play with them. So really understanding that kids are presenting a little bit younger than they are and a little bit less skilled, and giving them an assist, setting them up for success, pairing them thoughtfully, not always burdening the same kids with that hard to manage kid, simply because they're kind, but maybe making sure that the interactions that hard to manage person is having to very small, brief interactions, so that we're not only not overburdening that kid who is partnered with them, but that we're also helping the kid who is still working clearly on those skills not blow up their social life. And then recognizing that kids are never getting a break. Their online lives and their offline lives are all one and the same, all blending together, and talking to them about balance, talking to them about how they're organizing their time, recognizing that their stamina is still down, and that risk-taking is still hard because sensitivity is still high, and doing whatever we can to have well-calibrated risks for them. So as an example of that, and this would apply to any class across the board, if somebody is skipping class, trying to get to the root of the problem. So it's sort of their interest versus the position that they're taking. Their interest might be to miss Spanish, or their position might be to skip Spanish, but their interest is that they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their friends. And so we want to then be coming up with sequential risks that they can take. One of the problems with 504 plans as they exist is that often people write a plan and then they stick it away and they don't look at it again for another year. Whereas if somebody is anxious, we want to be making sure we're continuing to move the dial, so that maybe first they're not getting called on at all, and then they're getting called on, but we are feeding them the question in advance, and we're continuing to work toward having them participate just like the other students.
That's very, very helpful. I'd love to open it up to questions at this time. You can type them into the chat. And while those are coming in, Phyllis, I would love to hear from you a story about a child and maybe what they were challenged with over this past year. And again, how you helped them to solve for it.
Sure. So one of the more powerful stories for me, and I can think of so many coming back from the pandemic, but this was as we were first re-entering. One student didn't come back, and not because they were sick or there was a vulnerable family member. In fact, at first we didn't know why they wouldn't come back. We just knew they were refusing to come back. And slowly but surely, we were able to draw from them that they were afraid they would get teased for gaining weight during the pandemic. And so just as I was talking about with the sequential risks, scaffolding the risks, we tried to strike a deal with this kid where we said, if you come back, what is the most stressful part of the day? For him, it was PE. Well, what if we didn't have you go to PE? What if you came back, but we had you come in that first time after PE and gave you a pass on PE because, again, perfect is enemy of the good. At this point, we just wanted to get him back in the building. And eventually he agreed to do that. But when he arrived, it was recess. And so everybody was outside. And the second he walked out onto the blacktop where they were playing basketball, he was attacked by his friends with hugs, with like whooping and hollering and welcoming. And you could like see his whole body relax. And he didn't even skip PE that first day. He just felt accepted and happy to be back. And the worry that had just taken on this bigger and bigger importance and become so inflated in his mind just dissipated. And so we really want to constantly be looking for those moments, for that root cause of what is getting in that child's way, and how can we move the dial to get them to a place where we can get them comfortable again. But that one was so moving to me because kids really do want to be good people. I know we focus so much on the negative side of the pandemic and all of the things that kids are struggling with, but I also see some positives, including a lot of gratitude just for those simple interactions and milestone events. So it's not all bad.
Thank you for reminding us of that, because I'm sure that all educators do what they do because of that, because there is so much good. Someone did ask for me to share the 12 superpowers again, so I'm going to pull that up on the screen while I ask you another question. You mentioned long wait lists for students needing mental health services. So how can we help to best support students who are waiting in the interim for that, really in-depth personalized care?
I think we want to have really open communication with families, really non-judgmental, supportive, open communication, which can sometimes be challenging because when parents are stressed because their child isn't doing well, that can sometimes negatively impact the way that they interact with us as educators. So we have to really, gird ourselves sometimes for stressful interactions, which I don't have to tell anyone on this particular call. It looks like everyone here is an educator. But what we can do is connect with them, find out what's going on in their family or in their life, ask them how we can support them, because whenever we support an adult, we are supporting the child. And then we can try to connect with the kid. And if there's an adult that seems to connect more with that child than another adult in the building, maybe they could invite them for lunch. Maybe a counselor could invite them to a group that they think might be helpful, whether it's a friendship group or a worry buster type group or an affinity group, and really looking for opportunities to have those meaningful, substantive connections. Just as I said in the beginning about how that's what's most useful for adults, that's what kids need too. You can turn around. I mean, the nice thing about kids is that they can be down in the dumps and then be on top of the world 20 minutes later. I mean, they can then cycle back down again too, but it's really rewarding because when you connect with a kid in that way, you can see instant results often, or instant improvement at least.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of fluctuations, as I have observed, not only being a parent, but also coaching teenagers as well. So Selena is asking what your recommendations are for students who are completely disengaged over several months. They're wearing their hoodies, they have masks on, they put their earbuds in, and they're not engaged at all with classes or school activities. And a lot of them have trauma since coming out of COVID, and it's really hard to re-engage them into the school environment. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it sounds like the student is depressed too, and probably needs more than what the school can offer. And I think so that we don't set ourselves up to be discouraged, we want to really be focusing on the things that are in our control, that sweet spot between the things we can control and the things that matter. And so we can try to find something that child might be interested in, or ask them to weigh in on an assignment. Is there something that they would like, a way that they could tailor it so that it's more appealing to them? Is there somebody that they would want to work with? If we notice that they perk up a little bit around one particular kid, we can make a point of pairing them together. That would be the type of student that I would drop the rope. I wouldn't fight them over every last, oppositional behavior, I would let the small stuff go. Me personally, the hoodie, or if they cannot learn because their earbuds are in, that's one thing, but I wouldn't worry about the smaller things, because when you drop the rope, then they have to grapple with the decision instead of fighting with you. And so we need to be looking constantly for what's in it for them. What is it that they want to accomplish or get out of that class? And how can we meet them in a way that will just bring them in a little bit? And once we get a toe in the water, then it will be easier to get a little more traction. But in a situation that's that extreme, I would imagine you would also need some outside supports as well.
Thank you. We have another question from someone who is in student support at a school, and they're wondering, how do you enable your teachers who struggle with building positive relationships with their students? How do you get them to be more receptive and willing to bring some of the tips that you shared today into, really building deeper relationships with their students? That it might not be natural to some
Yeah.
of these folks. So how do you get them to integrate these
Yeah.
ideas?
I mean, I've definitely been in that situation many, many times, and I actually operationalize it for them. So they may never want to do that kind of work, but what I might have them do is something like this. If a student is asking for an extension and they're that teacher who just doesn't care what's going on in their personal life, it's just a flat no, I might suggest that they try asking 5 questions before they say no. Tell me why you need an extension. How much time do you need? What do you think would be helpful about that in particular? Or what could I do to make it easier for you to complete this assignment on time? Something that's really not too personal for them, for that teacher who's uncomfortable with these kinds of interactions, but just delaying that no, so that the kid at least feels heard. And I think it's important to explain to teachers that validating doesn't mean that you agree or you approve of a student's behavior. It just means you understand. So rather than having the knee-jerk reaction of, what were you thinking, or why did you do that, to say something like, I can tell you're feeling really embarrassed right now, and I would feel embarrassed too if I thought that someone was trying to embarrass me, and then move on from there. But nobody can calm down until they feel understood. Nobody's going to engage if they don't feel understood. And I think that really reinforcing for the teacher that what's in it for them is that they will be able to accomplish their objectives in a more expedient way with less resistance if they can practice some of these techniques. Even having a poker face, it's another way to operationalize it. Don't show your reactivity. Kids are going to misinterpret anything as negative, even if it's seemingly neutral. If there's inconsistency, if you're looking at your phone while you answer, even if you're saying what they want to hear. So we want to be giving them our full attention and simply making a point of ensuring they feel heard, even if we don't end up doing what they want in the end.
That's great. Thank you. I have not seen any other questions come through. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Phyllis, for joining us today. Really helpful strategies. And I know that, these will be explained in much more depth when your book comes out. And so we will share your contact information out with everyone as well if they have any questions. Before we sign off, I just wanted to let everyone know that when the webinar does end, there will be a survey that launches, and please fill this out and let us know if you'd like to learn more about Daybreak School-Based Mental Health Program for the upcoming year. We partner with districts across the country to provide a 12-week evidence-based teletherapy program for students. We also offer mental health education for families and staff, and more. So we would absolutely love to connect. And again, thank you all for joining us. And you will be receiving a recording of the webinar, and we really appreciate your time today. So thank you again, Phyllis.
Thank you for having me.